Boldwood presents A Summer Wedding for the Cornish Midwife, written by Jo Bartlett and read by Emma Powell. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. Look at my beautiful girls. Colin Jones beamed at the reflection in the full-length mirror as he stood with his arms around his wife and daughter. And our Anna, all grown up and ready to go out and change the world. We're so proud of you, darling. Anna's mother, Maggie, reached up and planted a kiss on her daughter's cheek, almost dislodging the floppy-brimmed hat she was wearing for her daughter's graduation. Thanks, Mum. I'm not sure I'll change the world, Dad, but I can't wait to get started. My daughter, the midwife. Colin shook his head, letting his arms drop to his sides as if he still couldn't quite believe it. A university graduate in the family. You're definitely the brightest of the three musketeers. Maybe we'll have to let Anna break up the trio. She's got to make her own life now, Col. Maggie looked from her daughter to her husband and back again as they stepped away from the mirror. Anna was shaking her head so hard she was almost in danger of dislodging the mortarboard that her mother had helped her pin in place just moments before. The three musketeers are forever, always have been, always will be. Anna's decision to choose the university closest to home was so she wouldn't have to spend any length of time away from her parents. It probably seemed an odd thing for a 20-something-year-old to do, but as the only child of two only children, they really were one another's whole worlds. I was thinking we ought to take Vanna out for a trip to celebrate your graduation, and I found just the place. Colin grinned, his whole face lighting up with excitement, the way it always did when he was planning a trip in the old ice cream van he converted into a camper, just after Anna started secondary school, that they'd christened Vanna. In between their annual summer holidays in Port Agnes, on the beautiful Atlantic coast in Cornwall, the three of them took it in turns to plan road trips. They'd pick out weird and wonderful place names from the well-thumbed map book that only ever left the glove compartment of Colin's car when they were planning one of their adventures. Where is it this time? Anna raised an eyebrow. They'd been to Boggy Bottom, Droop and Giggleswick in the last year alone, when most of her mates were saving hard for weekends in London or summer breaks in Ayia Napa or Ibiza. Not Anna, though. Give her Boggy Bottom with her mum and dad any day. Ugly Green. What inspired that choice? Maggie was already laughing before she reached the punchline. The lime green tie you're wearing for your daughter's graduation? Cheeky. Come here and say that. Colin pulled his wife into his arms and twirled her around in a circle, making her laugh all the more. It was a family joke that he seemed to think he was some kind of fashion expert when it came to commenting on other people's outfits, when his own taste in clothes was definitely questionable. Good-natured teasing was a big part of family life, and their house had always been filled with laughter. Watching her parents together, Anna couldn't help smiling. Are you sure you two don't want me to bow out so you start having trips on your own? You've waited nearly 22 years to get your freedom back. Even as she said the words, she mentally crossed her fingers that her parents wouldn't take her up on the offer. When she thought any distance into the future and the idea of starting a family of her own, she couldn't separate that out from being with her wonderful parents, who'd already been in their 40s when she came along. She pictured a camper van of her own, trundling along in convoy with Vanna, her husband and children every bit as excited about a trip away with Nanny and Grandad as she was. But if they needed a decade of freedom between now and then, while she established herself in her midwifery career, then she wasn't going to be too selfish to let them have it. Having you never meant giving up our freedom. Having you meant we got what we wanted all along. Maggie smiled at her daughter, tears making her eyes glassy, as Colin nodded in agreement. I didn't know just how much until the day your mother put you in my arms. He slid his arm around Anna's waist again. But if we don't get a move on, you're going to be late for your graduation photos, and your mother's planning on buying the biggest size they've got to put up above the mantelpiece. We can talk about our trip to Ugly Green later, and the first thing I'm going to pack is this tie. Over my dead body, And you're not taking those hideous sandals you bought either." Maggie gave her husband a gentle nudge and took his arm on the other side of Anna. The three musketeers off to mark a special day in the history of their little family. One day, if Anna got her way, that family would be twice as big, with a partner and at least 2 children of her own. But the three musketeers would always be at the centre of her world. She couldn't imagine it any other way. Chapter 1. 18 years later. This is a crazy idea, isn't it? The suffocating feeling sweeping over Anna was only partly down to the wedding dress, designed for someone at least 6 inches shorter, which made it impossible to move her arms. What, trying to find a dress in the only bridal shop in Port Agnes instead of going into Truro? Her best friend Ella raised an eyebrow, but Anna shook her head. No, well, yes, but not just that. Trying to choose a wedding dress that's going to fit whether I'm 5 months pregnant by the wedding or still the same shape as a slightly lumpy ironing board. If someone didn't unzip the itchy lace on the back panel of the dress soon, Anna was going to rip it off. It's bad enough tracking my temperature and jumping on poor Brae every time there's the remotest possibility that I might be ovulating. But I had no idea planning a wedding could completely take over your life too. Now I know why most people give it at least a year. First of all, you do not look like an ironing board, and no one says you have to wear a traditional wedding dress. Ella gave her a level look. Brae would marry you in your underwear. In fact, he'd probably like it, and I bet he likes being jumped on too. Don't even joke about the underwear thing. I've been having anxiety dreams about walking down the aisle naked as it is. Anna laughed. However horrifying the thought of displaying her lumpy bits in public might be, Ella was right. Brae wouldn't give a damn what she wore, and she felt the same about him. Not only that, she had Ella with her every step of the way too, and she couldn't have asked for a better bridesmaid, or a better friend. When Ella had joined the midwifery unit that Anna headed up, they'd immediately hit it off, and it was Ella who'd set her up with Brae in the first place. Port Agnes had been a haven for both of them when they'd needed it most. As long as you don't want me to go naked too. You know I'd do almost anything for you and Brae, but I've got to draw the line at that. Ella grinned and Anna laughed. When you agreed to be my bridesmaid, I promised I wouldn't make you look like you were dressed as one of the sweets from a tin of Christmas chocolates, or put you in layers of orange tulle. I'm hoping that when Susie gets back out here, she'll have something both of us can live with. As Anna moved, the bones sewn into the side of the bodice dug into her flesh. Oh, in the meantime, can you unzip this thing for me before it brings me out in a rash? No problem. As it turned out, Ella had to give the zip a pretty hard tug. Susie, who owned the wedding dress shop, had insisted that most of the samples would fit Anna, and that would make it relatively easy to find her a dress she could take home straight away, if she didn't mind having one that had been tried on and probably rejected by every bride-to-be in Port Agnes. Although if the fit on this first dress was anything to go by, Anna wasn't holding out much hope of finding anything. Even Susie had furrowed her brow after the first couple of dresses, describing Anna as unusually long in the torso, even for someone so tall, and disappearing to find something more suitable for her apparently freakish dimensions. None of it was doing much to build up Anna's confidence. I keep wondering if I'm too old to wear a proper wedding dress anyway. I'm nearly 40. Who gives a stuff, even if you were 99? Ella was having none of it. You should wear exactly what you want to wear, whether that's a pair of jeans or mountains of silk and a train I can barely help you down the aisle with. It's your day. I wish Mum hadn't lost her dress. Anna swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. Maggie should have been here, sitting on one of the chairs covered in crushed velvet, staring at Anna with tears filling her eyes every time she came out of the changing room, even if the dress she was wearing was a monstrosity. It was such a rite of passage for mothers and daughters, and the ache that never left Anna intensified as she caught sight of the empty chair again. Shaking herself, she turned back towards Ella. It was Nana's before hers, and it would be right on the vintage trend now, but it got lost in the last move before they... Even after so many years, Anna found it hard to finish the sentence, to admit out loud that both her parents had gone. Every time she thought about walking down the aisle, she pictured another empty space. But this time it was next to her, where her father should have been. You might not have the dress, but you'll be sharing your mum and dad's wedding day. Ella's tone was gentle. She knew exactly why Anna had chosen the 6th of July for the wedding. Anna's parents had got married in 1966, just before the start of the Football World Cup, where her father would be working as a groundsman at Wembley Stadium, and her parents had spent a 2-day honeymoon in a London guest house before her father had started his new job. Anna's mother had returned home without her new husband and had always said that she'd married him accepting that his greatest love would always be football. But all that had changed when Anna came along. From what they'd said, the wedding had been very low-key, but wearing her mother's dress would have been really meaningful. So even if Susie miraculously found something that would fit Anna's apparently outlandish upper body, it could never measure up. "Okay, I've got 3 more dresses for you to try on." Susie smiled as she came back out into the shop with the dresses draped over her arm. "And 4 for Ella. You said you didn't have a specific colour theme, didn't you?" We're just going with the flowers the hotel has on display, and we're going to personalise our own centrepieces for the tables. We couldn't really expect them to do anything extra when they're doing us such a big favour by squeezing us in." The Red Cliff Hotel on the outskirts of Port Agnes was in an old manor house, and they'd booked the ballroom in the west wing. The 5th and 6th were the only days in July when there wasn't another big event booked in. It meant that they had to do all the setting up on the 5th, but with less than 50 guests it was doable. By the time the 7th rolled around, Anna would have a family again for the first time in years. That was 1,000,000 times more important than the dress, the venue, or any other detail that Brides Monthly might insist was essential to the perfect wedding. "Fantastic." Susie smiled again. "I'll leave you girls to try the dresses on and let me know what you think." Thankfully, she seemed to have picked up the fact that Anna didn't want an audience, or anyone to try and convince her that something looked okay when it obviously didn't. It was different with Ella. Anna trusted her implicitly, and there weren't many people in the world she could say that about. "Okay, you go first, and when we find something for you, I'll see if I can find anything halfway decent. If we find anything you like, I'll see if she can order something in the same colour for Jess and Tony." Anna channeled her inner bridezilla and hustled her best friend into the changing room. She might not hold out a lot of hope of finding the right dress for herself, but Ella would look brilliant in anything. At least one decision was going to be easy. Her other bridesmaids were midwives at the unit too, but bringing all 3 of them and hoping they'd all like the same dress had felt like asking for trouble. "I think this one looks like a wedding dress, especially as it's ivory." Ella emerged from the changing room in the last of the 4 dresses, screwing up her face in the process. "It's also a really similar cut to my own nearly but not quite wedding dress." "I can see what you mean, but the colour wouldn't have bothered me if you'd wanted to wear it." Anna scanned the younger woman's face, searching for any hint that she might be upset. Less than 2 years before, Ella had been very publicly jilted by her fiancé on the day of her wedding. And worst of all, it had been caught on film and become a viral internet sensation. If it still bothered her, even in the slightest, she was doing a very good job of hiding it. "I like all of them, apart from this one, but if it was down to me, I'd go for the grey dress. It's the perfect colour, and I actually feel quite slim in it." "Grey it is, then," Anna breathed out. "I suppose I'd better try and find something now. I wish I could wave a magic wand and give you the dress you really want, but just keep an open mind and give me a shout if you want some help." Ella waited outside the changing room, and Anna took the first dress off the hanger. She didn't even bother to ask Ella to zip it up before pulling it off again. There were big flowers decorating the waistband and shoulder straps, and it couldn't have been more wrong. She felt like a fairy on top of a Christmas tree, and an ancient one at that. Her dad wouldn't have been able to stop himself saying, "Are you really wearing that?" if he'd been there. She could still remember the time she'd channeled her inner Britney Spears and worn a denim cap and low-slung jeans with a tiny crop top. Her father had looked her up and down for a moment and disappeared without saying a word. A minute later, he was back with a big overcoat, which he'd insisted would improve the outfit no end. And the truth was, he'd been right. But not even a giant overcoat would save this one. Pulling on the second dress, she couldn't help shaking her head, even as she tried to listen to Ella's advice and keep an open mind. "Do you want me to zip it up for you?" "I suppose so." Anna drew back the curtain, and Ella quickly zipped up the dress. Stepping out, she just hoped it would look better in the soft lighting of the shop. If anything, it looked even worse. "Do I look as uncomfortable as I feel?" "The dress is fine, but it's not you, is it?" The puffy skirt would have looked cute on someone short, but it made Anna feel like a drag queen with none of the glamour. "I hate it almost as much as it hates me, judging by the static shock it gives me every time I move." Anna pulled a face. "At least there's one more to try. I just need to get this monstrosity off first." "What's it like?" Ella's voice was tentative before she came in to zip up the last dress. "I don't know yet, but it already feels a lot better than the others." "Well, if the front is half as nice as the back, I think you're onto a winner." Stepping forward, Anna could see how the dress really looked for the first time, and she actually felt like doing a game show hostess twirl. The dress was vintage style, and it was by far the closest to the one her mother had worn. She could almost hear her mum whispering in her ear that this was the one. Turning around to face Ella, she smiled. "So, what do you think?" "It's perfect." It was Ella who said the words out loud, sniffing hard. "You look so much like your mum in the photos you showed me." I know it sounds stupid, but it's almost like I can feel her here when I'm wearing it. "It's not stupid." Ella slipped an arm around her waist. "And Brae is going to think he's gone to heaven when he sees you walking up the aisle towards him." Anna nodded, trying not to think again about the fact that she'd be walking up the aisle alone. Losing both her parents in such quick succession had been like someone pulling the rug out from under her feet, and she wasn't sure she'd have survived if she hadn't been able to bury herself in her job. Her boyfriend at the time, who she'd met just after leaving uni, had been sympathetic in the beginning, but in the end, even he'd told her she needed to get over it. Did you ever really get over losing the people you loved, though? Anna had learned to live with it, like anyone who'd lost someone had to. It had probably been inevitable that she'd lose her parents sooner than most people. Her father had been 44 when she was born, and her mother had just turned 40. But facing her wedding day without them had brought their loss right back to the surface again, even after all this time. Her mother had died from pancreatic cancer, which had swept through her body like a forest fire, taking her from her beloved family less than 6 months after the diagnosis. Her father had been completely devastated, and, when he died of a heart attack 3 weeks later, Anna was convinced it was because his heart had been broken by her mother's death. The only comfort was that both her parents were no longer suffering. As an only child, losing them both had left her rootless, but her work had got her through. The first few years were a blur of taking as many shifts as she could, but accepting a job in Port Agnes, her dream job, heading up the new midwifery unit, had turned out to be the start of slowly piecing her life back together. Now she was engaged to a man she adored, and who she was certain her parents would have loved if they'd only got the chance to meet him. She'd never be able to replace her mum and dad, but having children of her own and recreating some of the memories and traditions that had made her childhood so wonderful might just lessen the ache. She wouldn't be alone in the world any more then either. There'd be people who shared her DNA and that of her parents. Family meant the world to Anna, more than ever since she'd lost hers, and she desperately wanted to have one again. "Oh my God!" Ella jumped up as a crack of lightning lit up the shop, followed a split second later by a rumble of thunder. A storm wasn't just coming, it was right overhead, and it had come out of nowhere. "I hope that's not an omen." Anna wasn't normally superstitious, unlike her mother, who'd looked for signs in everything that happened. but with the rain already coming down so hard that it was bouncing back off the pavements, and the sky such a dark shade of grey that it looked almost black in between the flashes of lightning, it was hard not to feel a sense of foreboding. My dad always says a thunderstorm is a fresh start, a way to clear the air and wash away your problems, so I take it as a good omen. Ella suddenly shivered despite her words. I just hope the boys got the boat back into the harbour before it started. Surely they'd have seen the storm coming from across the water long before we did. Anna jumped as a gust of wind rattled the shop door, making it sound as if someone was desperately trying to get in. I don't know why Brae's got this crazy idea into his head about catching the fish for the wedding breakfast anyway. Because he's an old romantic. Ella laughed at the look that must have crossed Anna's face. Most people wouldn't put fish and romance together, but Brae was different. He'd spent years in the Navy before taking over his parents' fish and chip shop in Port Agnes when they'd retired to Spain. So, one way or another, the sea was in his blood. With Ella's boyfriend, Dan, acting as Brae's best man, he'd also been roped into a series of fishing expeditions to catch the sea bass that Brae had persuaded the head chef at the Red Cliff Hotel to serve for the fish course. They'd started early so that they'd stand a good chance of catching enough and storing it until the big day in a freezer he'd bought and put in the garage especially. Anna just wished they'd settled for something from the hotel's usual supplier, or even some fish fingers. Anything, as long as Brae and Dan weren't out at sea in a storm like this. I'll just give them a call to make sure they're okay. Anna picked up her phone. The call went straight to voicemail, but she told herself that didn't mean anything was wrong, even if she'd much rather have heard Brae's reassuring voice instead of an automated one at the other end of the line. However difficult a day had been, just speaking to him could always make it better. No luck? Ella didn't look worried, and Anna swallowed down the panic that she knew would rise in her chest if she let it. She had to stop thinking that things could go wrong at any minute. Just because her whole world had collapsed before, it didn't mean it was going to happen again. And if she spent all her time worrying that it would, she was going to miss out on so much. It's fine. You know Port Agnes is filled with places where it's almost impossible to get a mobile signal. I'll try again later, if we don't hear from them first. How are you getting on, girls? Susie stepped back as she caught sight of Anna. Oh, that's the one. Please tell me you've chosen that. I have. Anna had almost forgotten she was wearing the wedding dress. The street outside the shop was already looking more like a river than a road, and another crack of lightning lit up the sky, making the lights flicker. Oh, I haven't seen a storm like this in years. Susie didn't seem remotely concerned, even when the lights flickered again before going out altogether. But then the person she loved most in the world probably wasn't out at sea in a ridiculously small fishing boat in the middle of it all. It's so dark I can't even double-check the price, but whatever it is, I'll be taking 75% off. That's way too generous. You said 50% for one that's been used as a sample, but this is in pristine condition. Anna tried to look at Susie, but her eyes kept being drawn back to the sky outside, which had grown even darker. An old-fashioned streetlight mounted on the wall of the shop opposite suddenly came away from the brickwork and smashed down into the road. Did you see that? The storm's getting worse. It'll pass soon, and don't worry, I'll call Adele, who owns the shop opposite, and ask if she needs a hand clearing up the glass. Susie's voice had a sing-song tone as she brushed off Anna's concerns. As for the discount, 50% is a reduction for the sample, and the other 25% is because you delivered Maisie. Jenny said she couldn't have got through it without you, and that little girl is the light of my life. The older woman smiled as Anna finally turned to look at her. She'd overseen the delivery of Susie's granddaughter 6 months earlier. It had been an unexpectedly rocky delivery for a home birth, but thankfully everything had turned out okay in the end. I'm really more than happy to pay what you charge everyone else. I won't hear of it. Susie crossed her arms. And the same goes for Ella's bridesmaid's dress. And they say the only reward of midwifery is the job itself. Who knew we could get all this discounted stuff? We've been missing a trick. Ella laughed, and Anna felt her shoulders relax. No one else seemed concerned about Brae and Dan. It was coming up to the anniversary of losing her mum, so maybe she was just being silly, letting the time of year get to her the way it always did. The least she could do was be gracious about Susie's offer. "If you're really sure, thank you so much." Anna stepped forward as Susie enveloped her in a hug and a cloud of Chanel No. 5. It was the same perfume her mother had worn, and it seemed like another good sign, even to someone with as few superstitions as Anna. Before Susie could reply, the door of the shop was flung open by a woman who looked like she was in her late 50s, letting in a gust of wind that lifted up the skirt of the wedding dress, like Marilyn Monroe standing over that infamous subway grate. "Oh, I'm sorry, Susie. I know I'm more likely to sprout wings and loop the loop above the Sisters of Agnes Island than get wet again, but I've got to come in before I get blown straight back down the high street and into the harbour. I thought I was never going to make it up the hill as it was." "Don't be daft, Janice. Come in and shut that blessed door. You don't want to be out in this. I'll light one of the gas rings out back and boil some water to make us all a cuppa. We can all wait it out here until the worst of the weather passes." "Now you're talking." Janice took off her coat and shook herself like a wet dog might have done, and with the same complete lack of self-consciousness. "If you can muster up some biscuits to go with that tea, I promise that if I ever do find husband number 4, you'll be top of my list to buy a frock from for the big day." "I'll see what I can do, as long as you promise not to scare Anna off with tales of your divorces. She's just about to embark on her one and only wedding, God willing, and the last thing she wants to hear is that all men are useless." "I think both you girls would be better off assuming that. Then anything else would be a bonus. All this hearts and flowers stuff Susie peddles is just setting you up for a lifetime of disappointment, in my opinion." Janice made eye contact with Anna and dropped a perfect wink. "Although, whoever he is, he's a lucky fella." "She's marrying Brae from the Chippy." Susie imparted the information, and Janice shrieked in response. "Oh, I love him. He batters the best fish in Cornwall, and he always gives me a few chips to get started on while I'm waiting for my order. You'll make a handsome pair, and your kids are bound to have red hair too, I'll bet, with both of you being ginger. They won't have to ask anyone to reach up and get them an item from the top shelf either, will they?" Anna couldn't help laughing, and everyone joined in. It was a compliment of sorts, and she always loved hearing how well-liked Brae was. Not that she'd ever doubted she was making the right decision, but without the possibility of gaining her family's approval, it somehow meant a lot. "I'm definitely hoping we'll have a family one day." Anna had to keep reminding herself that it wasn't a given, and that, if it didn't work out that way, she was still incredibly lucky to have found Brae. She didn't need to be a midwife to know that starting a family at almost 40 wasn't what Mother Nature necessarily had in mind. But the fact that she'd been a late baby, and somewhat of a surprise to her own parents, also gave her hope. After years of nothing happening, Anna's mother had assumed she was going through the menopause before she discovered that a baby was finally on the way. Anna had to believe it would happen for her too, that there'd be a little girl she could call Maggie, or a boy who'd just have to put up with the fact that his middle name was Colin, even if it seemed a ridiculous name nowadays to ever assign to a newborn baby. "I don't mind if they're tall, short, or somewhere in between, but I've got to admit that I'd love them to have Brae's red hair. Mine is mostly out of a bottle these days." "And his sunny nature, I'll bet?" Janice tilted her head. "Although I've warned him more than once not to keep whistling in the shop when he's serving. It's unlucky. And if any of the fishermen hear him, they'll be blaming him for all sorts, even this storm." "I thought that was just if you were on board the boat." Susie pulled a face. "It's all stuff and nonsense anyway. Try telling that to the lads caught out in this weather." Janice wagged a finger. "My old dad spent his life on the boats, and he said whistling encouraged the wind to get stronger. He'd cuff my brother and me round the head if he ever heard us doing it." "I think it's more likely to be down to global warming." Ella's notion was about as unromantic as they came, and Janice sighed. "I don't know about all that malarkey, but when I rounded the harbour, a wave came right across the top of one of the boats that was moored there. If anyone had been on deck, that's the last we'd have seen of them. I just hope there's no one out there." "Brae and his friend Dan went out fishing earlier, and we've not heard from them yet." Anna whispered the words. "I'll try and call them again." Ella picked up her phone, shaking her head a few seconds later. "It's still going straight to voicemail. They'll be in the pub, I'm sure of it." Anna was trying to convince herself, but the hairs on the back of her neck were standing up all the same. "Oh, your Brae's a big, strong lad. He'll be right as rain, you mark my words." Janice reached out to squeeze Anna's arm, and a split second later a mobile phone started to ring. Realising it was hers, Anna rummaged in her bag, silently willing it to be Brae's number illuminating the caller display. When she finally located the phone, the call was from an unknown number. "Is that Anna Jones?" It was impossible to gauge anything from the man's tone of voice, but that didn't stop her pulse thudding in her ears. "Speaking." "My name's Gary Warner. I'm calling from the Coast Guard. We had a distress call from a boat that's registered to Brae Penrose, and your name and contact number were listed on the record." "Yes, he's been out fishing in the boat today." Anna was struggling to get the words out. She didn't want to ask any questions she couldn't handle the answer to. "We've located the boat." The man's tone was still deadpan, but Anna was weak with relief as she shot a smile in Ella's direction. "That's great. And Brae and Dan are okay?" "That's just the problem. When we found the boat, there was no one on board." "But that can't be right. They're both experienced at navigating the waters around here. They wouldn't just leave the boat. They'd wait until help came." Her words were tumbling over one another, and even as Ella reached out to take the phone, it slipped from Anna's hands. She couldn't lose another person she loved, and she absolutely couldn't lose Brae. She loved him so much. She would never survive it. Chapter 2. The fact that news spread like wildfire in Port Agnes could be a blessing or a curse, as Ella knew only too well. The small seaside town was built on a labyrinth of narrow roads which rose up from the harbour and clung to the cliffs, like the limpets in the rock pools on the wide stretch of sandy beach and the hidden coves just beyond it. By the time Ella and Anna had made it back to her parents in the bakery opposite the harbour, they'd already heard the news that Dan and Brae were missing. One of the crewmen from the lifeboat station had texted her father. Ella couldn't cry. If she did, it would set Anna off again, and one of them had to hold it together. When she'd taken the phone from her best friend, the Coast Guard had explained that Brae and Dan's boat had been taking on water when they'd found it, and fast. With the storm still lashing Port Agnes with a terrifying power, it might have seemed crazy for them to abandon the boat, but the Coast Guard said it was probably the right decision if they had some other means of making it back to the harbour. The trouble was, Ella and Anna knew exactly what they'd had to use as an emergency escape raft: a two-man kayak. Dan had already owned a half-share in a boat with his brother-in-law when he and Ella met, but when his sister had demanded that her husband spend a bit more time with the family, they decided to sell it. At the beginning of the summer, Brae and Dan had bought a small and fairly ancient fishing boat with a view to doing it up, and the four of them had had great fun taking it out to the coves around Port Agnes, staying fairly close to the coastline for safety's sake. They dropped the kayaks into the water in sheltered spots to get a closer look at the hidden caves and rocky outcrops that defined the coastline around Port Agnes. It had been blissful in the summer, and Ella had thanked her good fortune time and time again that she got to spend her free time with a man she adored, and the best friends who meant so much to both of them, in such a beautiful place, just a stone's throw away from where she'd been born and where her parents still lived. She hadn't ventured out in the boat since October, and neither had Anna. The boys had laughed and called them fair-weather sailors, but as far as Ella was concerned, it was just sensible. She had no desire to be on board in January whilst the boat plunged through swirling waves that rose and fell, taking her stomach with them. Brae and Dan weren't as easily put off, and now it looked like they might have paid the ultimate price. She wouldn't believe that, though. It had taken far too long to reconnect with Dan, her childhood sweetheart, and to realise the seaside town where they'd grown up was the only place in the world she wanted to live. Not even a violent storm could take that away from her. She refused to consider it. "Do you think we should go down to the lifeboat station and wait for news?" Anna asked the question for the third time in as many minutes, as steam filled the room where Ella's mother, Ruth, had hung their soaking wet clothes on a wooden clothes horse in front of the fire. They told us they'd call us as soon as there was news. Ella pulled down the sleeves of the fleece her mother had found for her to put on. They could have gone straight back to her and Dan's place when they'd left the bridal shop, but she'd managed to leave her key behind when she'd left home in a hurry that morning, and she wouldn't be able to get in again until Dan got home. Assuming he ever did. Anna and Brae's house was on the other side of town, and she didn't have to check with Anna to know that she wouldn't want to be that far away from the harbour when the lifeboat crew finally called. Instead, she and Anna were wearing a motley collection of old clothes that Ella hadn't considered worth taking with her when she'd moved out. They'd been soaked to the skin, in the true sense of the words, by the time they'd made it to the bakery. It was almost unheard of for her parents' shop to be empty of customers, but the storm had everyone battening down the hatches, and her mother had given them her undivided attention from the moment they'd shown up. "Are you sure I can't get you girls something to eat?" Ruth put another mug of sweet, hot, cure-all tea in front of them both, even though they'd barely touched the first. It was hard enough swallowing a mouthful of tea as the rain continued to lash at the windows and the wind made an eerie wailing noise that barely seemed to let up. The prospect of eating anything was impossible. "No thanks, Mum." Ella warmed her hands on the mug, but the cold seemed to have got into her bones, even as the fire continued to roar in the grate. "What about you, Anna? You look as white as a sheet. Have you eaten at all today?" Ruth Mahenick's voice was filled with concern. "I felt too nauseous to eat this morning before we went to try and find a dress. I think it must have been nerves. It seems ridiculous now. So unimportant." Anna sniffed, trying and failing to hold back the tears that kept rolling silently down her cheeks. "It'll be okay, I promise." Ella crossed her fingers behind her back. She was powerless to keep the promise, but if she believed it enough, that had to help Anna get through the wait, which might just help her to get through it too. "Your father's walked down to the lifeboat station to see if there's anything he can do to help." Ruth raised her eyebrows. Jago Mahenick was renowned for his strong opinions, and all Ella could do was hope that her father's interference didn't end up hindering the rescue efforts. She knew him well enough to realise he wouldn't just be able to sit around and wait. It was killing her and Anna as it was. "That's your mobile." Anna's shout almost drowned out the ringtone as Ella snatched up the phone. "Oh, Ella, thank God, it's Tony." It wasn't the voice Ella had so desperately wanted to hear, although judging by her tone, Brae and Dan's disappearance wasn't the only Port Agnes emergency in progress. Tony was another of the midwives at the unit, and she was usually pretty unflappable, but there was more than a hint of panic in her voice. "What's wrong?" Ella looked at Anna and shook her head, sending a message that the call wasn't about the boys. "I got a call out to Beth Jensen, who thought she might be in the early stages of labour." Tony's voice was tight. "It turns out she's a lot further on than she thought, and the baby must have turned into the breech position since her last examination. I've called an ambulance, but with the storm and a pile-up on the A39, they don't know how long it'll be before they get here. Even when they do, the paramedics aren't going to be able to help if the baby decides to put in an appearance before they can get Beth to the hospital for a C-section. Her husband's out on call with the lifeboat crew, and I can't get hold of any of the other midwives. I know you're not on call, but I'll be there as soon as I can. What's Beth's address?" Ella wasn't sure whether agreeing to help out with the delivery was a good idea, but Tony needed her, and so did Beth. It was also clear that Tony had no idea who it was the lifeboat crew was searching for, so at least the news hadn't spread that far yet. For a few minutes, Ella could pretend to herself that it wasn't happening too. There was nothing she could do to help Dan. He had experts out looking for him, and just waiting around was unbearable. Beth's husband was one of the people out trying to save Dan and Brae, so the least she could do was support his wife. It was a tiny way of paying back an immeasurable debt. "Thanks. It's Blackthorn Lodge on Miller's Lane, straight down past Miller's farm, and it's the second property on the left. Do you need me to bring anything?" Ella would fill Anna in as soon as the call ended and give her the option of coming along too. She wasn't sure if Anna would be up to it, and she wouldn't judge either way. They had to do what was best for Beth, It was the only thing in their power. "Just bring yourself, and please be as quick as you can." Tony disconnected the call before Ella could answer, and she looked across at Anna. "Tony's with Beth Jensen out at Miller's Lane. She's in advanced labour and the baby's breech. Tony's called an ambulance, but they can't guarantee when they will get there. She needs my help." Ella unhooked her dad's car keys from the spot where he'd always hung them by the back door for as long as she could remember. "I'm coming too. I've got to do something. I can't just stand waiting." Anna was already up on her feet, and it was pointless arguing with her. She was the most capable midwife Ella had ever worked with, and despite the turmoil they were both going through, she was certain Anna wouldn't let Beth down. Somehow they'd have to push away the thoughts of the lives that might be hanging in the balance out in the storm, and help bring a new one into the world. If Anna had thought about it, she might have questioned how she was functioning at all, let alone taking charge of Beth Jensen's delivery. It was as if being a midwife was imprinted on her soul, and even if she couldn't keep thoughts of Brae being missing out of her head, muscle memory seemed to take over. "What type of breach do you think we're dealing with?" Anna asked the question as soon as Tony answered the door to Beth's house, her face flooding with relief at the sight of Anna and Ella standing on the doorstep. "Judging by the position of the heartbeat, and what I can tell by examining Beth, I'd say we're dealing with a frank breach." Tony stepped back to let them into the house. "Well, that's some good news." Anna caught Ella's eye. They'd agreed on the way over not to mention Brae and Dan's disappearance to either Beth or Tony. It would be better for all of them if they concentrated on the delivery. A frank breach meant the baby was bottom first with its legs bent upwards towards its head. It was the next best thing to being head down and far less dangerous than if the baby's feet or knees emerged first. Anna just hoped Tony was right. "How's Beth doing?" Ella shrugged off her coat and took Anna's from her. The rain hadn't eased off, and just the short run to and from the car at either end of the journey had been like stepping into a shower on full jet mode. "She's okay. At the moment she seems more worried that Andy isn't going to make it in time for the birth than she is about the baby being breech." Tony pulled a face. "And she seems pretty stoical through the contractions. She was already in the kneeling position they advised her at the antenatal classes when I got here, and she said that was helping a lot." "Is she close to the second stage?" Anna followed Tony down the corridor to the kitchen so they could scrub up for a delivery that didn't sound as if it was going to wait for the ambulance to arrive, or for the storm to pass. "She went from 6 centimetres to 8 in less than half an hour, so by my reckoning we've got 20 minutes at the most." Tony looked from Anna to Ella and back again. "I'm so glad the two of you are here. I was terrified that you weren't going to make it, or that the electricity would go off again and I'd be left here alone, in the dark, in both senses of the word. I've never done a home breech birth before, let alone solo." "It'll be fine." The word sounded robotic, even to Anna's own ears. It was what Susie and Janice had said in the shop, after she'd taken the call from the lifeboat crew, and what Ella and Ruth had repeated over and over back at the Mahenick's place. She needed to convince Beth that it would be fine, though, just as much as she needed to believe what everyone else was saying about Brae and Dan would turn out to be true, and not just a meaningless platitude. "Let's go and take a look at Beth then, shall we? And see if we can get this baby to put in an appearance." Tony nodded, and the three of them trooped up the stairs, pausing halfway up as the lights flickered off again for a split second, before lighting up the way again, thank God. This was difficult enough as it was. "Hi, Beth. I'm Anna Jones, one of the midwives from the unit. I don't know if you remember me or Ella from any of your check-ups, but I think you've met us both, haven't you?" Anna crouched down by the end of the bed where Beth was positioned, with her elbows pressed into the mattress and her bottom sticking up in the air like a sort of downward dog yoga move. Beth turned her head to one side and nodded. I've met most of the midwives, I think, but frankly I couldn't care less right now who delivers this baby, just as long as he gets here safely." Beth grimaced, grabbing a fistful of the fitted sheet as another contraction took hold. "So we've got a little boy on the way then?" "Yes. Andy was desperate for a boy and he got his wish.
I'm sure you'll think it's an old wives' tale, but he had me down at the fishmonger's twice a week while we were trying for the baby, and he's convinced it's down to the sardines and oysters that we're having a little boy. Although I'd much rather have stuck to the cod and chips from Penrose Place. Even in the middle of labour, I wouldn't say no."
Beth spoke through gritted teeth, and Anna forced herself to focus back on the delivery, even as thoughts of Brae threatened to overwhelm her. Everyone seemed to know him, and loads of people would be devastated if anything happened to him. But Anna would be broken beyond repair. It scared the hell out of her that she loved him so much because there was so much to lose. But it was way too late to change that now. "I think you'll have earned a fish supper at the very least after this." Anna fought to keep her tone light. "Are you okay for me to examine you?"
"Go for it. Like I said, I don't care who does what as long as I get the baby out, and I'm past trying to hang on for Andy's sake. I just want it over now."
"You're doing brilliantly, sweetheart. Ella, can you take Beth's blood pressure, please, while I examine her? Tony, if you can get everything we might need, we'll be ready to go as soon as the baby decides it's time." There was a good chance Anna might have to intervene to help the baby out if it got stuck in the second stage of labour for too long.